Hey everybody, my name is Danny Dumas, and this is the Earn Your Title podcast. I'm here in studio with one of my favorite guests. I'm going to let her tell you what she does, how she does it. Before I do that, she is special because she's my sister, and this should be a good one. So Allison, we're going to talk about, we've been talking about school, going back to school, and specifically today we're talking about when your kids have problems learning and the different learning disabilities and this difference between maybe a disability and just needing a little bit of help. And that's what you do on a daily basis. So tell us what you do, and then we'll start talking about the problems we might experience.
All right. So I work for a company that contracts to charter schools and parochial schools. And my official title is psychology assistant, and I work with a school psychologist, and I help identify kids who have needs, disabilities, have special needs, maybe kids that are struggling in school and need special education. So I help do that identification process and reevaluation process, as well as counsel kids that are just struggling in school in general.
What would you say is like the number one or the top three things that when someone comes into your office, what is the problem they're having? And then what is the diagnosis? Or usually if you could pick top three or five, whatever it is, what is a teacher or a parent says, my kid can't do this. And then you say, oh, it's because of this. What are those things?
So with special education, so if you're a kid struggling in school, there's 13 categories that you would look at and say, all right, a kid is struggling. Do we suspect that there's a disability, and would that disability fit within one of these 13 categories? The main top 6 or 7 would be a specific learning disability. So that's kids who struggle in like maybe a specific learning component. So reading, like dyslexia, or math, writing, something like that. There's also what we call other health impairment. So those are kiddos that maybe have attention problems, ADHD, ADD. There's also one called emotional disturbance, and those are kids that are just really struggling emotionally and have a difficulty maintaining their frustrations and emotions in the classroom. There's also speech and language development. So that would be kids who need a speech and language pathologist, and they're struggling with their speech or language. And that would probably, and then intellectual disability. And these are kids who maybe have a lower IQ and just kind of struggling in adaptive senses and need help overall in all areas of their learning and education.
Gotcha. So as a parent, and I just went through this, my son, who I consider very intelligent, was struggling in school. From when he was younger, it was a focus thing. And we watched him progress, and he was doing okay, but it was hard for him. And so we decided we're going to go get some testing done. He went to a therapist, which I thought was really good. They just said, yeah, I think testing would be appropriate. And we found out he has dysgraphia, which was just his ability to hear something and then write it down with his hands. And which is interesting because he could hear something and like, Levi, just tell me a summary, like say it. And he's great. He would tell a great story. Like, you want to recap a movie? He's great, but he can't take that and write it down. What is the parent, like what is, as a parent, what do we need to be looking out for? And then how do we start that process of going to get our kids some help?
Yeah. So a couple things to know is every kid develops differently. And what most people don't really recognize is intelligence really levels out at about 3rd grade. So that means we'll get parents in kindergarten, and they'll have a kid who is struggling, and they're like, oh, my 5-year-old is not learning his numbers, and he's really struggling in the classroom. And typically on that case, we would say, all right, well, let's give him some interventions. Let's give him a little bit of extra help. But at that point,
He's 5.
He's 5.
Right.
Yeah. And they could develop in other ways. So, or you could have a kid that is like killing it in kindergarten. My kid's a genius. Let's put him in gifted classes. And the reality is he's 5. Right. So let's wait. Typically we'll wait to do any kind of evaluation until about 2nd grade. And as long as we see a pattern through that, because kids, we always say a summer can do a lot for a kid. We see kids develop, their emotions, they develop, and every kid develops at different times. So one thing I would do is I would look at your kid and say, all right, maybe they're just 5 and maybe they're a little bit more immature. Their birthday matters. If you have a kid who has a summer birthday and they're struggling in school, they probably could have gone either way. Maybe they're the youngest in their class, or maybe they're the oldest in their class, so that matters. But if you have let's say a second grader or a third grader, and you see a pattern of difficulty, really, you would at that point go to the school and say, I see that my kid is struggling and I would like some help with this. And you become the advocate for your kid. The truth of the matter is by third grade, second and third grade, hopefully the school has come to you and said, we have noticed that your kid is struggling in these areas. And hopefully there's some kind of intervention program that has started for your kid.
And I think it's important, when you see your kid struggling, and as a parent, you don't want to take that on like, what did I do to my kid? Or like, this is my fault because he's struggling. But I think it's important. And I think we're in a society now where people realize that it's okay if your kid is not like an amazing academic student. Like I know, like when I was younger, I think this was a Dumas thing. I struggled with spelling.
Yeah.
Did you struggle with spelling?
Yes, absolutely.
To the point where like, if I knew I had a spelling test, it was tears at home studying. I just can't hear a word. Teacher says a word, I have to write it on a paper. Maybe I have dysgraphia when it comes to spelling. And Levi, my son, was the same way. He just struggled, can't spell. And at some point, me and Andrea would sit down like, Levi, listen, you only need to get through this. You have to try your best. You don't have to be an A student when it comes to spelling. And I'm like, and don't tell anybody this, but when you get old enough, the computer's going to spell for you.
Right, yeah.
You just got to get close, and I think we've created a society where there's some things that truly aren't a fundamental skill that we have to have. And my grandparents had to spell because they were typing it on a typewriter with no help, or they were handwriting it. And if you misspelled, you were seen as being ignorant or, lacking education. Well, now, I've got some people in pretty high levels, even with spell check, they'll send out emails. I'm like, oh my God, did a 3-year-old write this? But it's not as important. So I just think you can kind of take some of the pressure away as a parent to say, I failed because my kid can't do this. There's a world where they could be successful without that skill and that. So like, can you speak to like, what maybe like if your kid has a problem here, maybe he has a superpower somewhere else, and like the balancing of that, hey, maybe he's just not going to be good at math, and that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the reality is not every kid is an A student, and that's okay. Like I think A has become the average, and it's not.
Right.
Like C's get degrees.
Right.
And I'm not saying that kids shouldn't try their best, but I do think, and I see this a lot in the school, we'll have families who they have 4 kids in the family. 3 are just doing awesome in school. And then they have the 1 kid who's getting B minuses, C pluses, and they want their kid evaluated because they think their kid needs special education. Right. And we come to them and say, no, your kid just is not as good in these academic areas as maybe your firstborn was, or maybe the baby of the family was. And that's okay. So I do think setting realistic expectations around education is important. And also, when we look at kids, especially if the suspected disability is specific learning disability, we look at a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Right. So, some people are really good at math. Some people are really good at English. And it's just a matter of, they're going to excel in some areas and there's going to be deficits in others. And what we can do in the education system is help where those deficits are. I have twins. And they were born exactly the same time. They were been raised the same way. Finley, my girl, she is really good in math. She just has a math brain. She thinks in math terms. She does really good in math. Whereas my boy, Eli, he's really good with language and he can read better than Finley can, but Finley does better in math. So if I compare the two, they're both doing well in school. Right. One has a strength in one area and a weakness in the other's vice versa. I can't look at that and say I did better for Finley or did better for Eli. Right. They're just individual kids.
And they're going to be different people.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. It is okay if your kid gets C's in high school, he can go be successful. And even in it used to be like going to college was the standard for success. Well, I think we realize that it's not. A bunch of us and our generation have huge student loans for degrees that we're not using. And I think we can encourage our kids, hey, if you're not college material, that is okay, because there's a lot of other ways to make a successful life with not being good at math. And technology is changing that a lot too.
Sure.
You know, I would encourage Levi, I'm like, buddy, your ability to talk to somebody is probably a better, more marketable skill than someone's ability to write a report. Cause you know, ChatGPT is going to be writing a report.
Sure.
So that's the truth right now. You still have to be able to process ideas and these things, but ultimately education is going to be different for the way we see it. But I think when you think of special education, there's a stigma, and it goes back to the way our special education was and what that meant for, you know, if you were put as a special ed student, what that meant from a social standpoint was pretty devastating. Can you speak to now, like, what does it look like in today's high school, elementary? What does that look like?
Yeah, and we do see this. We'll have a meeting with a parent and say, all right, your kid is struggling. We're wanting to evaluate them to see if there's a disability to be put in the special education, get an IEP or individual education plan. And they'll push back. Like, no, I don't want that. I was in special education and I was thrown in some classroom in the basement of the school with 4 other kids. 2 of them couldn't speak. And, I felt like I didn't get a good education. I didn't get to have recess with my friends. And we have to tell them, like, that's not how it is anymore. Really, what special education looks like right now is maybe you're in the classroom and the teacher's teaching English and you have an intervention specialist who is like the special ed teacher. They come into the classroom alongside that student during that lesson, and they may modify that curriculum a little bit, explain that a little bit, help them out with that assignment, or during that English time, they'll pull that kid out of the classroom and spend 20, 30, 35 minutes with that student, and maybe even in a small group. They'll have a couple kids there, and they'll modify that curriculum just to make sure that we're closing the gap where that is. But it is very rare. I mean, it still happens some depending on the severity of a disability, but for the most part, your kid is going to look like every other kid in the classroom. And to be honest, as someone who pulls kids for certain things, kids want to leave the classroom. And a lot of times I'll walk into a classroom and they'll say, Mrs. Robertson, can you come get me today? No, this is not your turn. Let me grab somebody else. So the stigma is definitely different. And you can be encouraged that your kid will remain in the general education population. And
for better or for worse.
For better or for worse, exactly, yeah.
Can you speak to the difference between like an IEP and accommodations and what that looks like?
Yeah, so there's a couple of routes you can go. So some of you have heard the term 504, and that's an accommodation plan. So a lot of kids that we see don't need special education. They don't need modified curriculum. They just need accommodations. And a lot of kids who have attention problems will get put on what we call a 504 plan, and that basically allows for accommodations. Those accommodations would be preferential seating. They get to sit in the front as opposed to the back, frequent breaks. Maybe they get a reduced workload. So every kid in the class has to do 10 problems, but this kid only has to do 5 because it takes them longer. Sometimes they remove the time restraints on these assignments. So those are your 504s. I always like to tell the parents an accommodation plan is like, I normally wear glasses, and that's an accommodation for me. I don't need the world to change. I just need to put something on to help me see the world like everyone else sees it. And that's kind of what an accommodation does for kids. We just put them at an even playing field with the other kids in their classroom. So that is a 504 plan. That is not considered special education, but a lot of kids get put on those plans. And then kids that are really struggling, when we suspect that there's a disability that requires modified curriculum, at that point, they would go and get an IEP, and that is quite the process. It starts with, you might have heard of the term MTSS, which is multi-tiered systems of support, or RTI, which is response to intervention. They kind of get put in this program, they get these interventions, and they move up the ladder. And if we don't see progress, then we say, all right, this kid does have a disability. It's affecting their education. It's affecting their learning. So we're going to give them an individual education plan that's going to be geared towards this kid, and we're going to pull them out or push into the classroom, and we're going to make sure that this kid, we can help close the gap.
Do you see any negatives or positives to getting the IEP like earlier than later, as far as like following them in the workforce or into college?
Yeah, so I would say, again, I always hesitate putting a kid on a plan really early, because the intelligence levels at third grade, but definitely if you're seeing your kids struggling, they need help. And that process starts with those interventions. So if your kid's not getting any intervention and they're struggling in school, you have to be the advocate that goes to the school and says, my kid's struggling. But what happens is when a kid gets put on an IEP, every year that IEP gets reviewed by the intervention specialist and the team that's in the school. So every year they're updating the goals, they're tracking the progress of the goals. And then every 3 years, that kid is getting reevaluated. So if they get evaluated and identified in grade 3 and third grade, then at 6th grade, they're going to get a new evaluation. We're going to look at updated data. If they continue to qualify, then they're going to qualify. And then in 9th grade, they'll qualify again, or maybe they get taken off. Most of the time, kids that qualify for an IEP don't get off the IEP, and that's okay. That's not obviously you want to meet the goals. Some kids may never meet those goals, and that's okay. We don't want to pull services from kids that still need them. Again, if you said, all right, Allison, you've had your glasses long enough, let's take your glasses off. Well, that's not fair for me because I'm not going to be able to see. Some kids just need glasses for the rest of their life. And then an IEP, as far as going to college, that doesn't really transfer into college, but a 504 could. So you could get accommodations in college, and which could be really helpful.
Speaking at the college level, I teach at the college level. It's the Fire Academy, but it's still a college level courses. And the students that have them, IEPs, they go in and from what I understand, they register that what it was, and then we can give it to them. And this is hard. And if you have maybe a college student, they now have to advocate for themselves. And I think that's probably the big difference between college and high school. In college, they have to say, this is what I have. They have to go make it official. And then we get that paperwork back saying this cadet has unlimited time to take the test. And it really can't help. We have students that struggle, and if they fail a test, we have to have remediation. So we sit down, hey, just letting you know you failed. It's not acceptable. You're not meeting the standard. And we'll ask, in high school, did you have an IEP or some type of accommodations? They're like, yeah, I did. I'm like, do you have them here? No, I don't. Well, why? I know they don't want, a lot of them don't want to have more time, but sometimes you just have to have more time. And it's okay, because the goal is to test your knowledge. That just might take you more time. And I think that we have to get away from what is normal, because I like the idea of neurodivergence, that there's people, that there's a spectrum of the way people think. And there's some things that seem negative, like attention deficit disorder can seem really negative. Mm-hmm. In my world, in the fire service, I would say over half the guys that I work with have some form of ADHD, whether it's a disorder, maybe not, but they're they're all over. And that is a huge asset, because we have a word for when you focus at an emergency. It's called tunnel vision, and it's a negative word. If we showed up and all I can think of is there's fire blowing out this window and I fail to see the electrical line that's laying on the ground, I step on it and die. So it's a benefit to be able to kind of bounce around and move your focus. So that is a superpower when it comes to firefighting, where in a classroom it's detrimental. And so I think it's important that you realize that your kid is not broken because they do things differently. They're different for a reason. They're supposed to do something else. The kid that's bouncing around, he's not going to be the accountant. Yeah. The accountant's going to be the little kid that focuses and is good at math.
And he would be miserable if you were an accountant. I have a third grader that last year we were talking about an evaluation, and he probably has dysgraphia. He has not been diagnosed yet, but in just kind of looking at everything, he probably has dysgraphia. And I talked to the mom, and she said, I just don't understand, because he can work on cards with his grandpa all day long and focus and be able to do things with his hands, and yet he can't copy from a board. And I told her, I said, he could probably, if he took long enough, he could write a 3-page report. Right. But that would be excruciating for him. And he can do it. It would just take a really long time. And I compared it to me. I'm not a marathon runner. I could run a marathon. Right. It would take me about a month, and I would be miserable and I would be hating everyone around me. But if you force me to do it, I could run a marathon. I would hate my life after that because I'm not a marathon runner. I don't have the training. I really don't have the ability right now. Maybe I could get there. I don't know. I don't want to. I don't want to run a marathon. But if you forced me to do it, I could. But I really enjoy other things. And there's things that if you put a basketball in my hand, I could probably run a couple miles dribbling a basketball during a basketball game and be really happy about it. So I think the important part is not putting kids in this box that says, all right, you got to write this report. This third grader, he's going to end up being a very successful mechanic, or he's going to work with his hands in some way. It's just not going to be writing reports. And that's okay. Now, we want him to be a well-rounded student. So we do want him to learn writing skills. We do want him to know grammar. There's some things that everyone should be a well-rounded person, and that's important. But in the end, he's going to live a really awesome, happy life because he's going to live on a farm one day and he's going to work on machines and he's going to do great.
Well, I think the point of education is that you figure out where they're at and then you move them up. Some acceptable level that we determine. But everybody doesn't have to be equal. You don't have to have, equal number of math, science, English, composition, credit. You don't need that. And everyone's all over. The point is that if you started here with math, you should go here. Now, some people start here and go here, and that is okay. And it's encouraging, I think, that the educational system has realized that, because for a really long time, it was standard. You do this, then this. Where do you see education going in the future? Like, what's the next newest types of education? Like, I know in the community that I live in, we had a meeting with the school superintendent, and she asked, how can my students get access to and start learning about being a firefighter, being a paramedic, non-college based futures? Where do you see the education as a system, as a whole, going with kids who think differently?
Sure. I think in general, we have learned that the trades are awesome, that if we can get some kids, that college is not for everybody, and some kids need to learn how to, be an electrician, or some kids are going to do really good as a machinist or whatever. So I think we've learned to really involve the trades in the education. I used to work at a school that was a credit recovery high school. So kids that were really struggling in school, they would come in, they would do their regular classes, but there was tracks that they could go through. There was a business track where they could learn about business. There was a construction track where they would get a lot of their credits through construction. Their math credits were them cutting wood and learning those skills, which is really awesome. There was a STNA track so they could get into the medical field or and learn kind of maybe how to be a nurse or how to just work as an STNA, which was really neat. So I think that's what's happening. And I'm pretty sure I read an article in Michigan that they are now requiring finance. I think they're requiring a finance course in every high school.
And I think they also, they're requiring CPR for everybody to graduate.
That is very cool.
That makes sense.
Well, in the high school the district that I live in Barberton, their big thing is, and I'm going to get it wrong because I'm on the spot, but I think it's enlisted, enrolled, or employed. And every kid that graduates from Barberton High School, as they walk across the stage, they're asking that they're either enlisted in the military, that they have a place of employment so that they're working, or that they're enrolled in higher education, whatever that looks like, or a trade school, which is really cool. So it's used to be you graduate, you go to college, you figure out what to do with your life. Now it's you graduate and maybe you go to the military, you enlist, or maybe you get employed and you get a good job and you start working and making some money, or maybe you go to higher education and figure out what you're going to do. But I do think everyone has recognized it's not cookie cutter anymore, and that's okay. And that we're celebrating people's differences and the uniqueness that they have, which I'm excited about.
Yeah. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you'd really like to share about the accommodation process, or parents interacting with their students, or what? Anything I didn't ask that I should?
Well, I would just say we see two types of parents typically that come in this process. We have parents who are in denial. They don't want their kid to be identified. Maybe they, like I said before, they were in special education. They felt like there was a stigma around that. And for those parents, I would just say, open up your mind a little bit. It's okay for your kid to need help. That's not a death sentence. We want to help them. And in general, schools want to help. So if you get called into an office and said, hey, your kid's struggling, they're not trying to demonize the kid. They want to help them. So go along with that and ask as many questions as possible. But the other thing I would say is, a lot of these schools have hundreds and hundreds of students. And if you see that your kid is struggling and they're not getting help, you have to be an advocate for your kid. Yep. You have to go into the school building and tell them, my kid is struggling. And if the school's not listening to you, the best thing you can do is you can write a little note that says, I want my kid to be evaluated, or I want my kid, I need a meeting. If it's put in writing, they are required by law to respond to that request in writing. And if you feel like the school is not listening to you, you can write that letter and remind them, you have to respond to my letter. And that is something important. So we have to be an advocate for our kids. We know our kids better than anybody else. And if you want your kid to get help, make sure that you go after it. Don't let it be 8th grade and all of a sudden say, oh man, I wish I would have done this or this. Start it when they're young and allow that process to take place.
And your job is to ensure they're getting an education, which also means you have to be educating your kids.
Sure.
I think sometimes I go to work, I send my kids to school. When they come back from school, they should be smart, educated. That's not really how it works. The parents have to be involved. Like if your kids don't understand how a credit card works when they graduate high school, you failed. It would be nice if the high school did that. But you need to teach, like Allison's here visiting from Ohio. My nephew, who is, how old is Eli?
He is 7.
7. He helped me make breakfast. And we had to combine something we're doubling the recipe. And I would ask them, here's the recipe, now double it. What is that? And they had to use math. Like you have to be involved as well. Like as dads, this is our job. Educate your kids. If their high school is not going to give them the hands-on stuff, that's on us. We have to do that. And I think it's important that it's not like a separate thing. You should be constantly educating your kids. Now, when they become teenagers, they might not want to listen to you. Sure. You have to keep doing that, but it is important that we are involved. So
yeah. Well, and I think even in education, like we talk about like collaborating with the parents, like we are a team. No decision gets made without the parents and the district and the teachers and the intervention specialists coming together and making that decision. So you need to be an active participant in your child's education because it's important.
That's awesome. Well, this has been the Earn Your Title podcast. This is my sister, Allison, and I'm so happy that you guys joined us. I can't wait to talk to you later. Have a great day. Bye.